Greeting, friends and brethren. This is Dr. Bob Thiel for the Continuing Church of God. There's a lot going on in the world today. People want to know about the Great Tribulation. They want to know when it is, what signs to look for, how to be spared from it. So a lot of people looked at the wrong things or for the wrong things, and I've tentatively titled this sermon, Counting Down to the Great Tribulation. Now, the idea of having concerns or questions about the future isn't new. Wondering about the hour of trial is something that Christians have long wondered about. And we go to the book of Matthew chapter 24. We'll see some things about Jesus' disciples because they had concerns and they wondered probably a lot of the same things that you wonder yourself. I'm going to mostly be reading from the New King James Version of the Bible, but I want to start with Matthew 24 with verse 3. Now as he, that's Jesus, sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" And Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many." Well, like you, the disciples wanted to know, but notice that Jesus warned them about being deceived, including from people who claim that Jesus is the Christ. Yes, these are people who claim to be Christians. There have been various deceivers throughout the world. And even within the Church of God movement, we've had various ones rise up. One person who said it had to start in 2008. Then you've got some Sardis-type groups who basically have become preterist, which basically means they believe, like some Protestants do, that everything Jesus said in Matthew 24 was for the people he was talking to then. Okay, basically all those things have already happened up until Jesus' return. Even some of them actually believe that Jesus came, by the way, around 70 AD. It's absurd. We have a sermon about preterists that you can watch. One of the reasons we can be certain the Great Tribulation has not started is we haven't seen all the signs that are required. And we're going to go through some of those today. Now, a lot of people don't want to know about prophecy, even though the Apostle Paul wrote, "Do not despise prophecies" in 1 Thessalonians 5:20. A lot of people say, well, they only want to hear about Jesus, but as it says in Revelation 19, verse 10, we're supposed to worship God because the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. Prophecy is important, between a quarter and a third of the Bible, or a fifth and a half, depending on how you count it. And I'd like to read something from Jesus regarding world events and what a Christian should do. This is from Luke 21. I'm going to read verse 36. Jesus said, "Watch therefore, and pray always, that you may be counted worthy to escape all these things that will come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man." Notice he said to watch. Watch what? Well, various things that he mentioned in this case, Luke 21, many of which are also in Matthew 24 and some other verses of the Bible that we're going to go into. This is something that Christians are supposed to be doing. And this applies to us now, and not just those people back in 70 AD. Now, one thing that has got some people hung up about end-time prophecy is their concerns about the nation of Israel and this generation. The tiny state of Israel became an independent nation May 14th, 1948, and officially recognized May 1st, 1949. One of the problems with this, though, is, particularly in the Protestant world, is that they think that this little nation represents all Israel. But if you look in scriptures, I'm not going to go all these scriptures now, but in Genesis 48 and 49, for example, we see that the term Israel was to be applied to descendants of Joseph, to make 13 tribes, and that God separated the 10 tribes of Israel in 1 Kings 11:31 from those of Judah, which you can see in 1 Kings 12, verse 20. And the bulk of the people who are in the land called Israel, who call themselves Jews, we believe are from the tribe of Judah. Now, it was even prophesied that most would call the Jews Israel. This is in Isaiah 48, verse 1. "Hear this, O house of Jacob, who are now called by the name Israel, and have come forth from the well springs of Judah." And now that has happened today. People are calling this little nation of Israel, even though it's mostly just the tribe of Judah. You don't have to go there, but in James 1 verse 1, James directs his epistle to the 12 tribes that are scattered abroad, which means they weren't all over in the area known as Palestine, Israel, to this day. Now, many Protestants think that there are scriptures about bringing the children of Israel back into this land and that that's been fulfilled. The problem is that's simply not the case. Most of the Jews are not in Israel yet, and there was a Protestant writer who said that 93.5% of the Jews in the world will end up in Israel by 2012. And you say, but that's pretty old. Well, I just looked it up. It's still at this guy's website. There's actually supposed to be 14 to 18 million Jews, and that doesn't count the fact there's hundreds of millions of descendants of the other tribes of Israel. So they're simply not there. One of the things that people do is they point to passages such as Ezekiel 34. So why don't we go to Ezekiel 34? I'm not sure how much of this I want to read, but I'm going to read parts of this here. Starting verse 13. And I will bring them out from the peoples and gather them from the countries, and will bring them to their own land. I will feed them on the mountains of Israel and the valleys and inhabited places of the country. I'll feed them in good pasture. They'll lie down in a good fold, rich pasture. I'll feed them their flock and make them lie down. So people point to that and say, well, Jews are coming from all over the world. They're coming from Russia. They're coming from parts of Africa, parts of Europe, going down there. And that this is a fulfillment of this prophecy. But let's go down to verse 25. Or 24. I, the Lord, will be their God, my servant David, a prince among them. Well, David's not there. Verse 25, I've made a covenant of peace with them. They're going to dwell safely, etc. And that's not happened. The people in the Jewish nation of Israel, they don't dwell safely. They're armed to the teeth and just, they've had some battles and they've had other issues and such. But despite that, a lot of people claim that this is the end, and based on this, and this is a fulfillment of those prophecies. It's not. I found something from a Protestant pastor by the name of Harry Walther, and he says, this first time in history has the most accurate view of how much time is left for the biblical apocalypse to begin. Talks about the parable of the fig tree. There's a doomsday clock hidden within the Bible, and the world can't go much past 2021. Okay, and he has something, various years he's added up based on children of Israel, etc., going into the Jews going to the land of Israel, and he's got that the world cannot go past May 14, 2021, and that's simply not the case. Part of this has to do with the fig tree prophecy, as it's called in the book of Matthew 24. But part of the problem with that is they go and they try to tie that in, that Israel has to do with figs in Jeremiah chapter 24 itself. And he sees good figs and very bad figs. And basically it says God's going to do something with the good figs, but he's only bringing the good figs back. Well, if you look at the people in the land of Israel right now, they've just approved some version, or they're proposing a version of their parliament to not allow people to believe in biblical morality when it comes to sexual morality. I'm not going to go into all this, but it's enough in their politics that no, I don't think God only brought back those who believe that they need to live by every word of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures. Of course, they don't believe the New Testament either. So let me go to Jeremiah 24. This time I'm going to go down to verse 6. God says, I'll set my eyes on them for good. I'll bring them back to this land. I'll build them, not pull them down. I'll plant them, not pluck them. And I'll give them a heart to know that I am the Lord, that they may be my people, I be their God, and they'll return to me with their whole heart. That has not happened. But people say this is still being fulfilled by the Jews coming back to Israel. I mentioned the fig tree prophecy It's in 3 different parts of the Bible. I mentioned Matthew 24, so I want to read that one, starting verse 32. It's also in Mark 13:28 and Luke 21:29. Matthew 24, starting verse 32. Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branches already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see these things, you know it's near, at the door. He didn't say, when you see the nation of Israel formed, but that's how a lot of Protestants have interpreted. Surely I say to you, this generation will not pass away till these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, my words will not pass away. Now I'd like to read something from the late Dr. J.F. Woolvard, who's a Protestant scholar, and he cites these scriptures in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He says, a common interpretation has been to interpret the fig tree as a type of Israel, and revival of Israel is the budding of the fig tree. There is no scriptural basis. So I agree with Dr. Woolvard on that particular point. And you also have the reality that it's been over 70 years since Israel formed. You don't have to go there, but Job 42:16, it talks about Job lived 140 years, saw his children, grandchildren, 4 generations. Well, if you divide it by 4, you end up with a generation being about 35 years. All right. So, and we may have 30 or 35 years from when the beginning of Star Wars began, which could have been 10, 11 years ago. But even if it's longer, you'd think it would be not more than 70 years, based on Psalm 90, verse 10. Now, there is a chance it could be within 80 years, and there is a possibility Great Tribulation will begin there. But again, I don't believe that Jesus' timing about the generation had to do with the formation of the state of Israel. By the time the Great Tribulation occurs and Jesus returns, almost everybody who would have been alive when the nation of Israel was declared was going to be dead. So I don't think Jesus was saying, okay, there'll be a couple of small percentage of the population that have been alive the whole time. I think it's a greater percentage. Now, let's go back to, if you're in Matthew 24, let's go to verse 4. I mentioned Jesus said, don't let anybody deceive you. And then he says, in verse 6, you're going to hear about wars and rumors of wars. Now, the deception ties in with the ride of the first horseman, the rider of the white horse, in the apocalypse of Revelation chapter 6. The second seal, talking about wars and rumors of wars, second sorrow, ties in with the second seal being opened in Revelation 6 as well. And these seals are to be opened for some period of time prior to the start of the Great Tribulation, which we'll get to in the sequence in Matthew, back down in verse 21. And it's possible that we've seen the ride of the first horseman began perhaps in 2009, and perhaps the second horseman either in 2019 or 2020. Because the Bible talks about peace being taken from the earth, and we've never had such a weird situation in the world as we've had under the COVID situation as we have now. I'd like to read something that the old Worldwide Church of God taught. This is in its booklet on the Four Horsemen. It says, as the first horseman rides for his conquering and to conquer in the name of false religion, the second horse war is quick on his heels, instrument of conquest. But I want to go and read something from Luke, because I don't think the immediacy is quite there. Luke 21, starting in verse 8, Jesus said, take heed no one deceives you, if men of my name come saying, I am he, and the time is drawn near. Therefore don't go after them. But your wars and commotions, don't be terrified, for these things must come to pass, but the end will not come immediately. You know, how long there is a time gap between the horsemen is not specified. And by the way, we do have a sermon on the sorrows of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and I'm not going to cover all of that here. But I do want to read something that I've read before from Barnes' notes on the Bible regarding to the rider of the red horse. The power given to him that sat on the horse, and power was given to him that sat, take peace in the earth, they should kill one another. This would seem to indicate that the condition immediately preceding this was a period of tranquility. that was now disturbed by some causing discord and bloodshed. This idea is confirmed by the original words in Greek, the peace, that is the previously existing peace. When peace in general is referred to, it's without the definite article, the. And so we also need to consider that there will be a peace deal in Daniel 9:27, and we'll get to that a little bit later. And that during the ride of the red horse, there will be things that look peaceful. Okay. Now, there was a Jewish source that explained 10 realistic reasons why essentially World War III could start tomorrow. This was reported by Breaking Israel News in this month, in July of 2020, and talked about China versus America. And there I saw some more saber-rattling related to that in the news today. China versus India, North Korea versus South Korea, Egypt versus Turkey, Turkey versus Greece, and that could have been flared up too by the opening of the, in English I'd say it, Hagia Sophia, but in Greek apparently say it Hagia Sophia. It's a building that the Greeks originally built that now become, as of yesterday, a mosque. Egypt versus Ethiopia, and I saw something else about that a couple days ago in the news, yesterday actually in the news. Russia versus Ukraine, Lebanon versus Israel, Hamas versus Israel, Iran, Turkey versus Israel. They think that these things can cause World War III tomorrow. None of those can, but they're certainly consistent with Jesus' comment about wars and rumors of war. Getting to Matthew's account, let's go back to Matthew 6, 24 verse 6, I'm sorry, Matthew 24 verse 6. Jesus said, "See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." So the listing I just went through, and there's other conflicts in other parts of the world, they're not the end yet. And then it says things are going to get worse. We're going to have some type of, you can call it like a world war, nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There'll be famines, pestilence, earthquakes in various places, and these are the beginning of sorrows. But notice that while it's not the end, there are sorrows, and that's part of the countdown to the Great Tribulation. Now you should consider that since most end-time Christians are not Philadelphian, after the seals are open, this is not going to be accepted by most Christians until after the start of the Great Tribulation. If most Christians did recognize the four seals, they'd be willing to gather together and flee when they're supposed to, but most aren't going to, and instead have to deal with the wrath of Satan. You can read about that in Revelation 12 verses 14 to 17. Now I should comment that food inflation is associated with the red horse, the third horse, the black horse. And it's usually called the black horse of famine, but the word famine is not in the version of Revelation 6, 5 to 6, but Jesus did use that term. So there's going to be some famines, but we should expect to see food inflation, sometimes caused by government overprinting of money, which has happened in the United States and in Europe, crop matters, trade issues, agricultural practices such as heavy reliance on genetically modified crops is setting up the stage for possible crop failures. So that's got associated with one of the sorrows that Jesus mentioned, as well as the ride of the third horseman, the apocalypse. As far as the fourth horseman's ride, now this is the opening of the fourth seal. This also starts prior to the start of the Great Tribulation, which has to do with the fifth seal. And this talks about people are going to die, and it says in Revelation 6, you don't have to go there, in verse 7 and 8, it talks about power was given to them over a fourth of the earth to kill with the sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beasts of the earth. So it's not just pestilences that's going to kill all these people. There's also going to be wars and hunger. So it's kind of like the fourth horseman kind of completes the job, reaps more death associated with the second and third horseman, as well as his own ride. Now, we need to consider various things here, and one of the things we need to consider is something that I think will be the countdown to the Great Tribulation, and that's got to do with the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 9. So let's go there, verse 26. some in the Church of God and some, particularly amongst evangelical Protestants, are looking for some kind of a deal to take place in the Middle East. And that's consistent with what we read about in Daniel 9:27, but I want to go and start in verse 26 because I think this is overlooked by a lot of people. Daniel 9 verse 26 says, "The people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it will be with a flood, and till the end of war, desolations are determined." Now, you notice this is a prince, the people who are going to destroy the sanctuary in the city. Well, the city and the sanctuary were destroyed in 70 A.D. Emperor Vespasian had General Titus go in. He did that in 70 A.D. But notice that from those people, from the old Roman Empire people, a prince is going to come. And what's he going to do? Verse 27 says, he's going to confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. And I also should comment, some erroneously think this prince should be Jesus, but this is not it. This is because Jesus didn't come from the people who went and destroyed Jerusalem. Okay, the Jews were living there and they weren't trying to destroy Jerusalem, but the Roman Empire did. Anyway, he's going to confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he'll bring in to sacrifice an offering, and we see about the desolation and abomination here. Now, it's generally been understood that this 1 week covenant is considered to be probably a 7-year peace deal. It's going to be broken in the middle of it, so that's after 3.5 years. And we have information about that. We've got a sermon on it, and we've got an article about it you can read as well at the cogwriter.com website. I believe that very few will accept the confirmation of this deal as the countdown to the Great Tribulation. Part of the reason is that it's important to accept church governance, and a lot of people have not done so, and they won't do so. And because they won't do so, they will not understand prophetic events. Oh yeah, a lot of people convince themselves that, yeah, they'll be able to see and they'll be able to know. But that's not consistent with a lot of scriptures. Now, this particular deal has not happened yet. It has not been confirmed yet. Therefore, the absolute earliest that we could see the start of the Great Tribulation would be 2024. And that would probably only be if we see something happening in the next several months. Otherwise, it'll be later. Now, as it turns out, this one who's called a prince in Daniel 9:26, who confirms the covenant in Daniel 9:27, is called a king in Daniel 11. He will be the one who's known as the king of the north. And Daniel 11, by the way, actually requires 2 kings. And based on what we see in Daniel 9:27, it looks like one of these kings, one called the king of the north, is going to gain a lot of power sometime after this peace deal. And it may take a regional war or other war in the Middle East to have this kind of a deal. And we know in Isaiah 17 verse 1 talks about the destruction of Damascus, and that looks to be prior to the start of the Great Tribulation. And if so, that'll be a clear sign to those who discount biblical prophecy that it's coming to pass. Because Damascus has been, by its claim, the longest continuously inhabited city on the earth. And even if someone can argue with that, it hasn't been destroyed or turned into a ruinous heap since Isaiah was inspired to record this. Now, before I go any further, it should be pointed out that during the Great Tribulation, the European beast power is going to be wealthy and control a lot of the world's trade, according to Revelation 18. And currently, by the way, we are seeing Europeans make trade deals around the globe and trying to set up international standards for products and trade. And some of this is coming at the expense of the United States and its British descended allies. And trade wars look to be a factor in the European beast power ultimately attacking the United States at the beginning of the Great Tribulation. And I should also mention that Europe is in the process of moving more toward a digital currency. There was an announcement by the Central Bank of France related to this past week. Europe also has an enforcer for 666, in my opinion, someone who's supposed to enforce their financial regulations. That would be consistent with Revelation 13, verses 16 to 18. And when the Apostle John was told to write this stuff down, there was no way you could control buying and selling like you can now. And you can do that now. Now, I mentioned there were two kings in Daniel chapter 11. The other one is somebody called the King of the South. We've seen a lot of things working towards this. Here's something breaking Israel news, July 12, 2020. Talks about President of Turkey to turn the Hagia Sophia into a mosque, which he did, but says the Turkish president linked the decision to reviving Islam from Bukhara to Uzbekistan. And so basically he wants to go from into Central Asia. And there's a group called the Muslim Brotherhood, and their objective is essentially to have an Islamic nation that runs from Spain to all the way to Indonesia. They say Spain, across the Middle East to Central Asia and Indonesia, to be governed according to Islamic Sharia law. And I just went to their website and saw that was there again this past couple of weeks. And they want basically a pan-national Islamic caliphate that's ruled by something called an imam. Now, it's in our understanding of biblical prophecy, they're not going to end up with Spain. But the King of the South could go somewhere from Western Sahara, Mauritania or Morocco, all the way to Oman, and perhaps Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Iran, Pakistan, or Indonesia. I don't know how far it's going to go. The Bible doesn't indicate it goes past areas in the Middle East or Central Asia. And we can see something about who's going to be associated with this King of the South if we go to Daniel chapter 11. We're not going to go into this battle too much, but we see the King of the South is mentioned in verse 40. And the territories that get overthrown have to do with the glorious land, Israel-Palestine. Edom will escape. That's got to do with Turkey. Moab and Ammon, that's got to do with basically the Arab Peninsula and some of the Jordanians. But also we see the land of Egypt shall not escape. And then we also see Libyans, and this says Ethiopians, but the late evangelist Raymond McNair correctly said this is means Cushites, so we don't necessarily think that the Ethiopians are going to be in this. The Cushites are darker skinned peoples who are, for example, in Sudan. So the Bible's talking about a confederation of nations that runs from North Africa all the way into Central Asia, or at least the Middle East. And that's basically what a lot of Muslims want to have happen. And it's not just Muslims that want this to happen. The current President of the United States, the previous President of the United States, Henry Kissinger, so those are on the American side, but various ones in the European Union have called for essentially the Arab nations, the Muslim nations, to get together to control terrorism and to get together. And so that's been encouraged. Now, Turkey, for a time, will support this King of the South, and I think some of the recent decisions by its president, Erdogan, are consistent with that, but it will eventually betray the King of the South, as it says, consistent with Edom escaping, as I mentioned in Daniel 11, plus also there's a passage in Daniel 11:26. But I'm not going into all that because some of those things happen after the start of Great Tribulation. I'm trying to focus on things that start before to give you a countdown. King of the South looks like, however, it should be formed prior to the start of the Great Tribulation. So there'll be something going on there. Now, I think that during the ride of the Red Horsemen, we may well see an Iranian-Syrian force that's going to damage Jerusalem and the nation of Israel. We can read about that in Isaiah 22. Isaiah 22, starting in verse 6, says, Elam, and this has to do with Iran, bore the quiver with chariots of men and horsemen. And Ker, and that seems to have to do with Syria, uncovered the shield. And it shall come to pass that your choicest valleys shall be full of chariots, and horsemen shall set themselves in array at the gate. Verse 8, He, that's God, removed the protection of Judah. You looked in that day to the armor of the house of the forest. You saw also the damage to the city of David, now that's Jerusalem, that it was very great. So we see that we may see some type of a conflict, that Jerusalem will get damaged, and we might see this prior to the start of a peace deal. Some of the things I'm going through the Bible doesn't necessarily go into the sequence on it, but there are reasons to think that perhaps that would happen. And I mentioned about Damascus. Let me read that from Isaiah 17. It says, "Behold, Damascus will cease from being a city and be a ruinous heap." And that hasn't happened. And should Syria be involved in something that damages Jerusalem, this could be a consequence of it. You don't have to go there, but in the third verse of Isaiah 17 talks about the fortresses will also cease from Ephraim and the kingdom from Damascus. Damascus would end up being part of the king of the south. As far as the fortresses ceasing from Ephraim, that would be at the beginning or very near the beginning of the Great Tribulation. And the fortresses of Ephraim would basically be referring to, in this case, the United Kingdom. Now there's another thing that a lot of people haven't paid much attention to. This is a prophecy in the book of Habakkuk. It's interesting, my prior church God organization used to teach this, and they taught it. Now they don't teach it anymore, which doesn't make much sense. But Habakkuk 2, starting in verse 6, says, "Will not all these take up a proverb against them, a taunting riddle against them, and say, Woe to him who increases what is not his, and to him who loads himself with many pledges. Will not your creditors rise up suddenly? Will they not awaken to oppress you? You will become their booty, because you plundered many nations. The remnant of the people will plunder you." Now this is not a prophecy of that little nation commonly known as Israel. It doesn't have a lot of debt that prophesied enemies would want to take it over for. And the most indebted nation of all time is the United States. And it keeps increasing its debt. And this will end with the start of the Great Tribulation. You see that this person will be plundered. And by the way, you see about loading up with many pledges. With various quantitative easing programs and various deficit things that the U.S. government's doing, pledges or treasury bills or whatever, they keep inventing them. They just keep printing up money, and that's not going to end well. In Daniel 11:39, we read about a leader. Now this is the king of the north. This is that person who is the prince in Daniel 9:26 and 27. He confirms the covenant, Daniel 9:26, and he's still a prince. It says he is going to act against the strongest fortresses of the foreign god. Well, the strongest fortresses, the strongest military in the 21st century belongs to the United States of America. He's going to acknowledge and advance its glory. He's going to cause them to rule over many and divide the land for gain. Taking over the United States would certainly give gain to many that he could deny, he could go for and do. By the way, I know a lot of people don't think the Europeans are going to do anything. I'm going to hold up this headline. This is in GermanForeignPolicy.com this past week or so. And there's more from them. Basically, what they want to do is to figure out how Europe's military should happen. And another one down here, you can see this. Europe must take on its own defense responsibilities. So while a lot of people discounted Europe as irrelevant, since the Bible shows that Europeans will take over the United States, its British descended allies, the UK and Canada, they've got to be working on some kind of military. And they are. They actually have something called PESCO, which stands for Permanent Structured Cooperation. And this came within a year of U.S. President Donald Trump taking office. When he got in, he made comments Europeans did not like. And now, while PESCO is not in a position yet to take over the United States, they are working on things. Various European leaders, including German Chancellor Merkel and French President Macron, have said that Europe needs a military power that can go on its own and not rely on the U.S. anymore for defense. Now, a lot of people don't believe Europe will do that, but there's prophecies that the world will marvel in Revelation 13:4 about the beast power that the king of the north is ruling over. They're going to marvel because no one thought the United States, etc., could get knocked off. Now, in 1 Thessalonians 5, starting in verse 2, I'd like to read a few things the Apostle Paul wrote. For you yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. So when they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them as labor pains upon a pregnant woman, and they shall not escape. But you, brethren, not in darkness of this day should overtake you as a thief. Well, roughly 3¼ years after a peace deal is confirmed by this prince who becomes European king of the north, he's going to proclaim peace and safety. He's going to throw people off, and that's consistent with what it says about him in Daniel 11:24. Most are going to be caught off guard, including most Christians. Now let's go back to Matthew 24, and this time we're going to pick it up in verse 9. Jesus said, "They will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you. You'll be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And many will be offended and will betray one another and hate one another. There will be many false prophets who will rise up and deceive many. Because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold, but he who endures to the end will be saved." Now notice that during this time, prior to the start of the Great Tribulation, some of God's faithful are going to become witnesses. Now these persecuting times also tie in with Daniel 11 verses 33 to 35. So I want to go to there right now. It says, "Those that people understand shall instruct many. Yet for days they shall fall with the sword and flame by captivity and plundering. Now when they fall, they'll be aided with a little help. Many will join them by intrigue, and some of those understanding will fall to refine them, purify them, and make them white until the time of the end, because it's still the appointed time." Now this particular persecution is going to be directed primarily towards the Philadelphian Christians. Why? Because we will be the main ones explaining what the King of the North is about to do. The prior verses will be associated with that. Now, Satan won't just limit this persecution to Philadelphian Christians. He wants Christians gone no matter what. But initially, this will kind of help separate the Philadelphians from non-Philadelphians. The non-Philadelphians are going to say, "We're not that group. We don't believe in their governance. We don't believe in them. Don't pay attention to us." And they think they're going to escape, but they won't. Now, in Daniel 11:23, you don't have to go there. It says about this king of the north, "After a league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, for he's going to come up, become strong with a small number of people." Now he's one of the ones who's going to declare peace and safety just before he's going to attack. And people are going to fall for this. But in the book of Revelation 17, verse 12 and 13, the Bible talks about a reorganization coming to Europe. And many are talking in Europe about a reorganization. Now right now, the Europeans are actually getting along reasonably well to try to get some things done, even though there's lots of stresses and strains. But they're going to find that they are going to reorganize. The Bible says, verse 12, Revelation 17, "The 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as yet." So this will be a reorganization. "But they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. These are of one mind, and they'll give their power and authority to the beast." Now, whether that's got to do with the small number of people in Daniel 11:23 isn't absolutely certain, but it certainly seems consistent with that. Now, once this reorganization takes off, there'll be a series of prophetic events happening. And Christian groups who don't understand this reorganization are not going to... They've got misinformation out there. Some people say it can only be 10 countries. Some say it can only be 11 countries. People are not going to understand. Now, in Daniel 11:25, by the way, it says that this king of the north is going to have a great army. In Daniel 11:40, he's going to have many ships. And with the development of PESCO, I mentioned before, Europe is working on a great army. As far as many ships go, I don't know how many ships Bible they have to meet this criteria, but when I went to look this up a couple days ago, it said that the European Union has 513 commissioned warships. Sounds like many ships. Now, sometime after the deal in Daniel 9:27 is confirmed, people like me and other Philadelphians are going to proclaim that's what's going on. We're also going to be proclaiming the gospel message in Matthew 24:14. And I believe this is going to enrage the king of the north so much that he's going to start persecuting. The persecutions that I read about before from Jesus in Matthew 24, 9 through 13, as well as in Daniel 11, verses 33 to 35. And I think that they're going to get people to pay attention to the Church of God for a short period of time. And I think this is going to help lead to the fulfillment of Matthew 24, 14, which says, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come." I've been disappointed amongst the Protestant world and the Church of God world how many people don't see Matthew 24, 14 as being critically vital to the end coming. The end comes after Matthew 24, 14 is fulfilled. Now, in the Continuing Church of God, we've got a booklet, the Gospel of the Kingdom of God. You can find this or any other booklet I hold up at the ccog.org website. Go into the Literature tab under Books and Booklets, and you can find this. But also, if you go to ccog.org, if you stay on that page, not the literature page, and go further down, you'll see a listing of over 100 languages. And we have this book, I think, in 100 languages right now. Because we believe that when the media pays some attention to us, explain what the King of the North is going to do, and the King of the North is getting enraged, people of various languages are going to be interested to learn what is it that we teach, and we're going to tell people that, look, the King of the North is not bringing utopia. Of course, he won't call himself the King of the North. But he's going to be in league with the Antichrist and bring about the destruction of the United States, the British extended allies, eventually the King of the South as well, cause all kinds of other problems. He's not going to like that, but the media will cover this for some period of time, and I believe drive people to our website to learn more about this. You know, again, the scripture says this gospel kingdom will be preached to the world and the end will come. Well, Herbert Armstrong did his part, because I've had that people say, well, he did that. He didn't feel it was finished. And I've talked to people such as the late Deborah Pardian, who said, no, he was supposed to keep working on this later. Related to what's going to happen, there's going to be a short work, as it says in Romans 9:28. The late evangelist John Ogwyn wrote, God clearly states he'll finish the work and cut it short in righteousness, Romans 9:28. Who will he use to do it? According to Daniel 11:32, it's the people who know their God to be strong and carry out great exploits. And we intend to be doing that. And we'll see how God wants to use us to do so. Now, getting back to Matthew 24, here's a very important signal. Of course, they're all important signals, but here's what Jesus says, Matthew 24, verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Now, we read about the abomination of desolation in Daniel chapter 9. It's also mentioned in Daniel 11, verse 31. Some have apparently concluded the state of Israel needed to form before this to take place. And I'm not disagreeing with that. But I suspect that the generation that's supposed to see all this begins with the start of the beginning of sorrows. Because Jesus said this generation would not pass away unless all these things happen. Now, as far as the abomination, the old Worldwide Church of God, back in 1975, published, Jesus spoke of the vital necessity of understanding of this abomination in a parenthetical phrase, whoever reads, let him understand. It appears to involve a great religious leader who would make his world headquarters in the Holy Land. This event's great import lies in the fact it's a sign signaling the beginning of the Great Tribulation. So you notice, though, as I said, Jesus specifically referred to an event from Daniel as a sign to know when to flee. And this happens before the Great Tribulation begins. Now, you don't have to go there, but Luke 21, verse 20, Jesus is recorded as saying, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you know its desolation is near. So we see armies associated with the coming desolation. And that's consistent with Daniel 11:31. I'm going to read it. I alluded to it a moment ago. Let's just read it. And forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation. Now this him is the king of the north. And the Great Tribulation is going to take place after this event. Now, the Great Tribulation itself will not start before there's an actual king of the south and the king of the north. And we've got to have this prince to confirm a deal, and he'll become the king. Now, I want to go to Amos 8, and I'm going to read this from the Old King James, verse 11 and 12. Behold, the days come, says the Lord God, they'll send a famine in the land, not a famine of bread, nor for thirst for water, but hearing the words of the Lord. They will wander from sea to sea, and from north even to the east. They shall seek and run to and fro to seek the word of the Lord, and they shall not find it. With all the so-called limits on hate speech in more and more Western lands, saying that you can't even quote certain parts of the Bible, they consider it hate speech, or teaching against sin, we're certainly getting close to that time. Now, the final time Jesus referred to as the beginning of sorrows technically may not officially be considered to start until the first of the seven seals is open. And while it's likely that this has occurred, and the false prophet's undoubtedly alive now, it's possible it doesn't start until the false prophet gets more prominence, but that's not certain. But I do think that the last generation, the one supposed to see all these things, it's from the opening of the first seal. As far as the holy place goes, that location isn't totally clear. Now, the Apostle Paul is a prophet, and in 1 Corinthians 13, verse 12, he wrote, "For we know in part, we prophesy in part." That's verse 9. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 9. Verse 12 says, "For we've now seen a mirror dimly." So we don't see everything right now. Now, we know that Jerusalem's called the Holy City, Matthew 4, verse 5. And it was called the Holy City after Jesus' resurrection in Matthew 27:53. So we can glean that this is going to be a location in Jerusalem. So there's three possibilities that come to mind. One is somewhere in the area called the Temple Mount, or in another spot where the old temple was, because that's not as certain as a lot of people seem to think so. Or two, a building that contains some parts of the old temple. Or three, a place where Christians may meet in the 21st century. But what I don't believe is that this requires a massive Jewish temple to be built. Unless they put something on some spot that God happens to consider to be holy. Only God can make something holy. And Jews cannot make a holy temple. Not anymore. They can make a building, and if they put it on a spot that God considers holy, that's possible. But they rejected Jesus, and only God can make something holy. You don't have to go there, but 1 Corinthians 3, verse 17, the Apostle Paul wrote, "For the temple of God is holy, which temple you are." And Ephesians 2, now you might as well go there, Ephesians 2, starting in verse 19. He goes into a little more details about that. Ephesians 2, verse 19 says, "Now therefore you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom the whole building, being fit together, grows into a holy temple of the Lord, in whom you are also built together for a dwelling place of God in the Spirit." Christians are the temple of God in the church age. There's no Jewish building that would be. Now, that being said, the building that was in the temple was considered holy after Jesus' resurrection. That was the Holy of Holies, and you can see about that in Hebrews 9:25. Maybe God considers parts that were in that still holy. If so, there is one building that we're aware of in Jerusalem, and I've been there. Matter of fact, wasn't planning on doing this, but I'll show this here. Now, that's sort of a picture of some of the stones of it right here on our songbook. This is a building that is believed to have used actually bricks from the old temple. Bricks of the old temple were put there, and I was looking for a better picture, and I will show you a couple better pictures of it. They're just on the back of a couple of our booklets. These are actually those bricks. This is on our church history booklet. And this one is the section. The larger bricks are called ashlars, are believed to have been in the old Jewish temple, Herod's temple. So it's possible that God could consider that to be the location, but whether or not he still considers any part of that holy is not clear, because certainly it was defiled. It was defiled by various idols. It was also defiled by Islamic conquest, etc. It's one of the reasons I mentioned that the Apostle Paul wrote, "We know in part, we prophesy in part, we now see in a mirror dimly." So some of the things we see as possibilities, but we're not certain yet. As we get closer, we are certain we'll know. Now, the other possibility is if we end up getting continuing Church of God congregation in Jerusalem, and where two or more are gathered in his name, Jesus is there. It says Jesus said in Matthew 18:20. Currently, we don't have a congregation in Jerusalem, but it's possible that we might. We have some correspondence with some people over there, somewhat at least indirectly, through Ethiopia. Now, Jesus also talks about people fleeing, and since Jesus talks about people fleeing from Judea, some people are going to be there. And this king of the north might actually go to where Christians met, because in the end time, Christians are the temple of God. It says in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 4, and this confuses a lot of Protestants and some people in the Church of God, where it says, he is talking about the king of the north, sits in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. And again, that could be a place where real Christians met in that area. Now, as far as sacrifices go, the Jews have to start them before they stop. Now, there's groups like the Temple Institute and the reconstituted Sanhedrin. They've been preparing for this for quite some time, and they've done a couple of sacrifices. Now, they'd like to have a red heifer first, and they'd like it to cleanse a temple if they can get one. But I noticed yesterday they made an announcement again about the red heifer. They say they've got one somewhere in the land of Israel. They think it may qualify for what they want, but usually they tend to want to kill them at around age 3, which would mean that this would have to happen within the next year, if I understood the age of that particular cow. By the way, red heifer is a type of a female cow that's not been bred or had any calves, and they're kind of a reddish-brown color. And the Jews believe that there have been 9 perfect or close to perfect red heifers, and that the 10th one will be a sign that the end is to be here, and they're supposed to sacrifice it to cleanse their temple. But if they're not allowed to build a big Jewish temple, but they are allowed to sacrifice, it's possible that they'll just use it and cleanse something. They did a sacrifice to cleanse an altar about 1.5 years ago, and they had another type of a sacrifice earlier in the last. They tend to have a sacrifice once or twice a year, whatever they can get away with, but they want to go to daily sacrifices. So the Jews are willing to do it. Certain Jews are willing to do it when they're allowed to, and I think the idea about the red heifer might be a factor also in getting them to do it. Now, I'd like to read something that the late Herbert W. Armstrong wrote about sacrifices, temples, the abomination, and the countdown timing. He says, Daniel 12, verse 11, says, from the time the daily sacrifice takes away. Consider this for a moment. This does not imply a material temple to be built in our time in Jerusalem. It does seem to imply that Israelis may restore the twice daily sacrifice, possibly at the Wailing Wall. Now let me just go further here. It says in Ezra 3:4 that when they were in the area of the old temple, when they did not have a temple, that the Jews sacrificed. I have communicated with both the Temple Institute, which I went to and spoke to, and the Sanhedrin, which I emailed, and they were both representatives of both of them, assured me that they are willing to sacrifice without having a temple. Okay, they don't have to have a physical temple. They might get a tent or a small little building. Anyway, going back to Herbert Armstrong's writing, he says, the indications the armies of the beast of Revelation 17 entering Jerusalem will stop this daily sacrifice. What's the abomination? He says this refers to Daniel 11:31 and Matthew 24:15. He talks about the armies of Antiochus Epiphanes were Jerusalem, and they put a statue of Jupiter there, and this somewhat parallels what's going to happen in the New Testament. Then he says, from this time of Daniel 12:11, till Christ's coming will be 1,290 days. Verse 12 says, blessed he who waits and comes at 1,335 days. Never before have we understood this period of 1,260 days, 1,290 days, and 1,335 days. But it's evident now, this blessing is pronounced upon us, God's church, who wait and endure until 1,335 days, approximately 1,335 days prior to Christ's coming. By the way, for Protestant, we do not believe in a pre- or mid-tribulation rapture. We believe, as it says in Matthew 24, verses 29 to 31 or 2, that Jesus comes after the tribulation. Anyway, but since no one can know the day or the hour of his coming, we probably not know the exact day that this 1335 days begin. But apparently it's a time when our work shall end. He's talking about fulfillment of Matthew 24:14 and the famine of the word. And it's, I believe, even though I do think we're going to get our 15 minutes of fame to refer to an expression that Andy Warhol's been connected to. After they start reading all that we teach, I think we're going to get blanked off the internet. At least most of what we do. He says, that'll be the time united Europe will appear, revival of the Holy Roman Empire. We shall be warned and ready and taken to a place of refuge and safety from the Great Tribulation. 45 days later, the beast armies will surround Jerusalem. 30 days later, the Great Tribulation will start. And I'd like to read something that the old Radio Church of God put out about the Abomination. This is back in 1963. This is from Garner Ted Armstrong, who I did see in person before. Speaking in modern language, he says, when you yourself see a revived, remilitarized Germany at the head of the United States of Europe, of the coming third power bloc, marching into Palestine, better realize the abomination of desolation is beginning. When you see this, stand in the holy place and you flee. So the great pagan religions of the world, nearly always stemming from Egypt and Babylon, always have one thing in common: idolatry. And talk about having a great statue, which again Herbert Armstrong mentioned with Antiochus Epiphanes. And so this will have another fulfillment in the future, but not just an idol to become an abomination, but a living human being. So Garner Ted Armstrong associated idolatry with this, and we read about the mark of the beast, and I do associate idolatry with this as well. Now, Jesus said, when you see the abomination, desolation spoken of, to flee. Who's going to flee? Who's subject to fleeing? Well, let's go to Zephaniah chapter 2. This is something not widely taught. I was able to convince my prior church organization to teach us a little bit. Zephaniah 2, starting verse 1, it says, gather yourselves together, O undesirable nation. And we're called a peculiar people in Peter, and this is talking about end-time Christians. Gather yourselves together before the decree is issued. So before it's time to do something, you're supposed to be gathered together, for the day passes like chaff. Before the Lord's fierce anger comes upon you, before the day of the Lord's anger comes upon you. So this is before the Great Tribulation, the day of the Lord. And who's this? Why do I say it's end-time Christians? Because of the next verse. Seek the Lord, all you meek of earth, who have upheld his justice. Seek righteousness, seek humility. It may be that you will be hidden in the day of the Lord's anger. These people are seeking righteousness and seeking humility. They'll accept God's form of governance. Many people don't now. They despise prophecies or don't think Church of God can have any prophets and all this kind of stuff. But notice, people are to gather together before the decree is issued. Many people in the Church of God, particularly amongst independents and semi-independents, think they'll know the signs, it'll be totally clear to them, and they'll know when to go. Well, if they've not gathered together, it's not likely this is going to happen. You're supposed to be gathering together to support the work. The work, amongst other things, has to do with fulfillment of Matthew 24:14. And we're doing things on that right now. As a matter of fact, we just sent some additional funds over to Ghana to get the gospel booklet in the language, one of the major languages over there. And the more who support us, the more languages we will get our literature in, and the faster the end will come, because the end comes after Matthew 24:14 is fulfilled. Now, after you see the abomination, I would think the decree is going to confirm that that's the abomination. Okay? Some people make their own decisions, but those who accept proper biblical church governance will accept it at the right time. So what happens? Matthew 24, starting verse 16. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who's on the housetop not go down, take anything out of his house. And let him who is in the field not go back and get his clothes. Now this points to true believers being in Judea prior to the time of fleeing. Now this could be, by the way, Church of God members who live in Judea, but some who perhaps fled persecution. I read about the pre-tribulation persecution that Jesus said in Matthew 24, 9 through 13. I read about it also in Daniel chapter 11, 33 to 35. But places like Europe, perhaps South America, and elsewhere, because of the rising, supposedly Roman Catholic leaders who are the beasts of the sea and the beasts of the land. And by the way, if you are Roman Catholic, I hope this does not come across Catholic bashing. The beast and the false prophet are going to profess Roman Catholicism, but change it and not really believe in it. But this will get people in Roman Catholic lands at first to think, this is what they've hoped for. Great monarch is rising up. They're going to make the world Roman Catholic. Anyway, but I think that's what's going to happen. And we have information of sermons about fleeing and all that type of thing as well. Now, let's see what Jesus says next. This is Matthew 24, verse 19. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. Now, some might consider this to be a stretch, but it's possible that Jesus was, to a degree, encouraging the idea of birth control by telling his followers that they might not wish to become pregnant just before the Great Tribulation. Because why else would you say this? Again, after the deal in Daniel 9, 26, 7 is confirmed, after we know that. Now we might not know until after the fact, by the way. The fact that the leader who confirms it's called a prince, he may not be the top one associated with it. Matter of fact, it's also a possibility this could be a deal that, let's say, the Middle Eastern people make themselves, and then this leader later comes and confirms it. I don't think the deal is going to be so perfectly clear that most Protestant prophecy watchers or Church of God groups and people are going to understand it. I think it's not going to be that clear, and that's because Jesus only promised to protect the Philadelphians from the hour of trial upon the whole world to try the earth. And you can read that in Revelation chapter 3, verses 7 through 10. Now, sometimes some Protestants have pointed to that, explaining why they believe in a pre-tribulation rapture, but the Bible does not say that God is going to bring and protect all Christians. That's simply not there. As a matter of fact, let me make that even clearer. Let's go to Revelation chapter 12. Now, I'll read Revelation 3, one verse from there first, and then I'll go to Revelation 12. Revelation 3:10, talking to the Philadelphians, because you've kept my command to persevere, I will also keep you in the hour of trial, which will come upon the whole world to test those who dwell on the earth. So that is only to the Philadelphians, and there are other churches mentioned. We believe that, based on Jesus' words, there'll be remnants of Thyatira, Sardis, and the bulk of Christians will be Laodicean at the end, and they will not flee. Now, if you go to the book of Revelation, chapter 12, starting in verse 13, we see something here. It says, when the dragon saw had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. Now, this persecution is what I've said several times, Matthew 24, 9 through 13, and Daniel 11. I said verses 33 to 35, but it actually seems like it might start as early as verse 29. But notice what happens to those who are being persecuted, which again, this is why this is mostly to the Philadelphians. But the woman is given 2 wings of a great eagle. She might fly in the wilderness to her place where she's nourished for a time and half a time from the serpent. Well, the serpent doesn't give up then. Verse 15, serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, might cause her to be carried away from the flood. But the earth, this looks supernatural, helped the woman, And the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the flood, which the dragon has spewed out of his mouth. So these are people going to a place of protection, which is in the wilderness, according to this passage, which is, therefore, it's not heaven. Now, what happens in verse 17? Then the dragon was enraged with the woman, the Philadelphian Christians, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring, those who keep the commandments of God and have testimony of Jesus Christ. These are other Christians. This is going to be the bulk of Christians. They're not going to flee then, because they're not going to think it's time. They will not have paid proper attention to the signs, nor will they accept proper church governance. And, what a lot of people in the old worldwide Church of God forget is in the last several years of Herbert W. Armstrong's life, how much he emphasized church governance. And yet we have people who don't understand it. They either take it to an extreme, where, for example, they'll disfellowship you if you talk to relatives who are in another Church of God, and that's totally unbiblical, and they've got other unbiblical reasons, ways to get baptized and all this kind of stuff, requirements. Or they're too loose, too much committee kind of stuff, or they simply don't recognize the Bible says first apostles, then prophets, etc., or they won't accept those who God has in office. Anyway, I mentioned about birth control, because once you know this deal has been confirmed, you've got an idea when Jesus is going to return. I mean, well, you will have an idea too, about 7 years from then. But you'll have an idea when the Great Tribulation will start. So once we know that deal is confirmed, it's probably a good time to not get pregnant, because if you were to get pregnant, it takes 9 months. After you get pregnant, have the baby, and you start nursing the baby, and something you might nurse the baby for a year and a half or whatever. And so Jesus says, woe to those who are doing those things. So either the people who are going to have children would want to do it immediately once they find the deal's been confirmed, or be better off waiting if they can. And this is also reminds me, Paul talks about this present distress. It was better not to marry in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So at that future distress, it may be a better time not to get pregnant. Anyway, verse 20, Jesus says in Matthew 24, and pray that your flight not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. I just read a little bit about that plight in Revelation chapter 12. Now, there's no reason for Jesus to pray this. The Sabbath wasn't still going on. But Protestants have ways they try to reason around that. Now, after all these events that we talked about in Matthew 24, you read about the start of the Great Tribulation, verse 21. For then there will be great tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. Well, the reality is, Matthew 24:14 was not fulfilled by 70 AD. Okay? These other events have not happened. We haven't seen this deal of Daniel 9:26-27. We haven't seen a lot of these things yet. And that's why we can be certain that these things did not happen by 70 AD, or they did not happen last century or already this century. They just did not happen. Now, I want to go through kind of a brief basic countdown, if you will. So, basically, we're going to see sorrows and troubles continuing. Now, in Mark's account, Mark 13, verse 18, Jesus said there will be troubles, and these are the beginning of sorrows. And we have been seeing all kinds of troubles. COVID should qualify as one of the troubles. Anyway, we know that sorrows and troubles are going to continue, and other ones are going to start. All 4 seals related to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are going to be opened. And as I mentioned before, it's possible that perhaps 2 have already been opened. Or if they're not open, at least the seeds of them seem to be going on. There's other events that are going to be fulfilled as well. As I mentioned before, the Bible says some highly indebted nation, one that loads up pledges, treasury bills perhaps, is going to be taken over. And right now you see the debt acceleration happening more and more in the United States. Damascus is going to be destroyed, and great military damage is going to hit Jerusalem. And this is possible, this might happen before some type of a prophesied peace deal. But again, with some of these parts with the sequence, the Bible is not completely clear. But one of the most important things to watch for will be when the deal of Daniel 9:12 27 is confirmed by the prince. Not necessarily when the deal is made, but when it's confirmed by the prince. Maybe the prince will be involved directly, maybe indirectly. The Bible doesn't say. But as I mentioned before, I don't believe it will be clear enough. I know a lot of people think it'll be super clear. You've got rapturists, for example, like Hal Lindsey, who've indicated this deal will happen after they're raptured. So if he's alive when that deal happens, he's in his 80s now, if he's alive when the deal happens, he's going to say, this is not the deal. And even if he's not alive, people who believe like he does, and I think, for example, David Jeremiah, I think believes along that same line as well, will say the same thing. Anyway, we know that the king of the north is going to rise up and the king of the south. The two of them, by the way, according to Daniel 11:27, are going to make a lying deal to one another. Europe is going to get a great army. We're seeing that in process now. Europe's got to have many ships. It already has that. Now, in order for animal sacrifices to be stopped, they obviously have to start. And we know that there's going to be persecution. And we know the gospel, the kingdom, has got to be preached to the world as a witness, and the end is going to come. The Bible is clear that those sacrifices are going to be stopped, so seeing them started would also be a signal. Europe is going to reorganize into 10 kingdoms, and again, that's not necessarily 10 current nations. They're going to reorganize. And an abomination of desolation is going to occur in the area of Jerusalem because of the actions of the king of the north. And we expect that the most faithful are going to continue to tell the world what's happening until it's stopped and we see the famine of the world. Famine of the word. A decree is going to be issued, as it says in Zephaniah, and the most faithful Philadelphians are going to flee to the wilderness, and those in Judea should flee. And probably a few days prior to the start of the Great Tribulation, the two witnesses are going to get power to do their job. I didn't go into that in any great detail at this stage, but the fact is that they die a few days before Jesus returns, so most likely God will give them power a few days before the Great Tribulation starts. But most people will not recognize that they're the two witnesses until it's too late. Anyway, bolstered by the Antichrist, the Great Tribulation is going to begin. And this is going to eliminate the United States as Anglo-Saxon, Celtic descended allies. The Great Tribulation should begin about 3.5 years after the peace deal, Daniel 9:27, is confirmed. And right after, the king of the north is proclaiming peace and safety. Now, he might do it several times, but after one of those times is when he's going to do this. And people are going to be thrown off by this. And they won't think about his invasion plans. Now, I'd like to read what Herbert Armstrong said, how he thought this was going to begin. The Great Tribulation will probably start with a nuclear attack on London and Britain, and possibly the same day or immediately after on the United States and Canadian cities. The Great Tribulation, we shall then fully realize the time of Jacob's trouble, spoken of in Jeremiah 30, verse 7. And Jacob's name was named on Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, in Genesis 48:16. I alluded to that before. At that time, a third of the people in our nations will die, or having died by famine, disease, epidemics. Another third will die of war. Our cities will be destroyed. And the remaining third will be carried to the land of our enemies as slaves. Now, I should also comment that Australia and New Zealand are also descended from Ephraim and are also expected to be taken over. And that may involve Asian powers, let's say, for example, China. Please, don't believe those who say the Great Tribulation has already happened. Don't believe those who say watching biblical prophecy is not important. Let's go to Mark chapter 13. I alluded to this before, but I'd like to read this. In Mark 13, read some of the words of Jesus. Verse 33. Mark 13. Take heed, watch and pray, for you do not know when the time is in. It's like a man going to the far country, left his house, He gave authority to the servants to each do his work, and commanded the doorkeeper to watch. Now we're supposed to be doing the work. Watch therefore, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, in the evening or midnight, the crowing of the rooster, or in the morning, lest coming suddenly he finds you sleeping. Sleeping because people have a lukewarm attitude toward the work. They're not doing the work they're supposed to be doing. If you're doing the work, you're not sleeping. And those who are not sleeping would be awake. So they will know, based upon when we see the abomination, desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, as Jesus said, we will then know for sure. But we'll have a countdown when we realize that the deal of Daniel 9:27 has been confirmed. Anyway, Jesus said, don't pay attention to all this stuff. No, in verse 37, and what I say to you all, watch. And that's what I'm telling you. Well, the Great Tribulation has not started. We're seeing things that are happening, and I went over many things that are counting down toward the start of the Great Tribulation, which will happen. Before this happens, gather together and support the work that God wants you to do if you're a true Philadelphian Christian. This is Dr. Bob Thiel for the Continuing Church of God.